hung in the sky over Sodom, bathing the city in a pale, eerie light. The streets, which had long since abandoned any vestige of morality, were filled with noise and shadows, a reflection of the decadence that reigned there. Lot, Abraham's nephew, watched the city from the roof of his house, aware of the impending danger. He knew that Sodom and its neighbor Gomorrah were beyond redemption. Corruption had taken root so deeply that justice and goodness were mere distant memories. Two men arrived at the city gates at dusk. They were no ordinary men. Their faces exuded a supernatural calm, something that contrasted sharply with the heavy atmosphere of the city. Lot, upon seeing them, immediately recognized something divine in them and, moved by an impulse to protect them, ran to meet them. "Sirs, come to my house. Wash your feet and spend the night under my roof. Tomorrow you may go on your way," he implored, aware that hospitality was a sacred duty, even more so in the presence of heavenly emissaries. The men politely refused, insisting on spending the night in the square, but Lot persisted. He knew that the squares of Sodom were not safe, especially for foreigners. Finally, the men relented and followed Lot home. As they settled into Lot's house, a growing noise began to build outside. Men from all over the city, young and old, surrounded the house. They pounded on the door loudly, demanding that Lot hand over the strangers to them so they could get to know them. Lot, in desperation, went out to confront them. "Please, my brothers, do not do this wicked thing," he pleaded. In a desperate gesture, he even offered his virgin daughters to protect the guests. The men of Sodom, however, were not willing to negotiate. They tried to break down the door, and at that moment the two visitors intervened. They pulled Lot inside and slammed the door shut. Then, in an act of divine power, they blinded all the men outside, who groped in vain, trying to find the entrance. Opinion: this moment when the men of Sodom are blinded by the angels is a crucial point in the narrative. Not only does it demonstrate God's protective power, but it also symbolizes the moral blindness of the city's inhabitants, unable to see truth and justice even when it is right in front of them. Inside the house, the angels revealed to Lot the reason for their visit. "Let us destroy this city, for the outcry against it has reached the Lord, and he has sent us to destroy it," they said. Lot was instructed to gather his family and flee immediately. There was no more time. Lot ran to tell his sons-in-law, who were betrothed to his daughters, "Get up and get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city." But his sons-in-law laughed, thinking he was joking. Their unbelief sealed his fate. As dawn approached, the angels hurried Lot, his wife, and his daughters out of the city. "Flee for your lives. Do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be destroyed." Lot, fearing that he would not be able to reach the mountains in time, begged to flee to a small city called Zoar, which was granted to him. As the sun rose over the earth, the Lord rained sulfur and fire from heaven upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The cities, the people, the vegetation, everything was destroyed in an instant. As they fled, Lot's wife, disobeying the angel's instruction, looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt, standing as an eternal witness to the destruction and divine judgment. Finally, Lot and his daughters reached Zoar, the city that had been given to them as a refuge. The sight of the complete and utter destruction they left behind was a terrifying testimony to the power of God and the inevitable consequence of sin. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughters sought refuge in a small town called Zoar. However, fear and trauma from what they had witnessed prevented them from finding peace. Lot, fearing that destruction would also reach Zoar, decided to take his daughters to the mountains, where they could live in isolation and safe from any divine judgment or human threat. They found refuge in a cold, damp cave, far from any civilization. The days in the cave were long and silent, and the weight of isolation began to take its toll on Lot and his daughters. The young women, who had lost everything, began to fear for the future. With no men left in the region and believing themselves to be the last survivors, they began to worry about the continuation of their lineage. desperation led them to devise a dark plan to ensure their father's lineage. Opinion: isolation in the mountains is not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. Lot and his daughters are completely cut off from any community or moral support. This extreme isolation is a catalyst for the desperate decisions that follow. The lack of guidance and the belief that they are the last human beings alive distort the daughters' perceptions, leading them to take actions that would normally be unthinkable. This situation highlights how loneliness and despair can erode moral principles, especially in a context where there is no longer any hope or visible divine guidance. Lot's daughters, consumed with fear that their father's line would be wiped out, decided that the only solution was to get him drunk so that he, unaware of his actions, could father children with them. That night, the eldest daughter gave Lot wine until he passed out, and then she lay with him. The next day, the younger daughter did the same. Both daughters became pregnant by their father, and each gave birth to a son. Moab, father of the Moabites, and Ben-Ammi, father of the Ammonites, people who would later play a significant role in the history of Israel. Isolation in the mountains brought Lot's daughters to a state of deep despair. The destruction of their cities, the loss of their mother, and now the fear that their father's line would be wiped out all weighed heavily upon them. Convinced that there were no other surviving men and that they could not marry and have children, the two sisters began to devise a plan that under normal circumstances would have been unthinkable. The eldest daughter, overcome with fear that her father's name would disappear from the face of the earth, suggested to her younger sister, "Let us make our father drunk with wine and lie with him. In this way we will preserve our father's line." The proposal, which appeared as an extreme solution in the midst of desperation, was readily accepted by the younger sister. They were blinded by fear and the need to secure the future of their lineage. Opinion: the decision of Lot's daughters reflects the moral deterioration that can occur in situations of absolute desperation. Their plan to get their own father drunk and sleep with him is not only a desperate action, but also a demonstration of how fear and lack of perspective can completely distort values and moral judgments. This episode underscores human vulnerability when disconnected from any social, spiritual, or moral network, showing how isolation can lead to decisions that would otherwise be considered unacceptable. That night the sisters put their plan into action. They gave Lot wine until he was completely unconscious. Then the older daughter went into the cave and slept with him. Lot, drunk, did not realize what was happening. The next night they repeated the act, and the younger daughter also slept with her father under the same circumstances. Thus, both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their own father. The months that followed were marked by a mixture of relief at having ensured the continuity of the lineage and a moral burden that both would carry for the rest of their lives. The children were born and were named Moab and Ben-Ammi, founders of the peoples that would bear their names, the Moabites and the Ammonites. As the months passed, Lot's daughters carried in their wombs the fruit of his desperate actions. The silence of the cave, which had once been a refuge from the chaos of the world, now became a place of introspection and, at times, unspoken guilt. Lot, unaware of what had happened, continued his life without the awareness of the nights in which his daughters had acted to ensure his offspring. The children were born into isolation and were named Moab and Ben-Ammi. Each name carried symbolic weight. Moab means of the father, and Ben-Ammi means son of my people. These names not only acknowledged the children's incestuous origins, but also foreshadowed their descendants' future as people who would have a lasting impact on the region. Opinion: the choice of the names Moab and Ben-Ammi is significant and full of tragic irony. By naming their children in a way that reflects their heritage, Lot's daughters not only acknowledge the incestuous act, but also solidify the connection between their actions and the fate of future nations. This reveals an acceptance of the past and an understanding of its consequences, but also a resignation to the inevitability of their choices. The names serve as a constant reminder of the fine line between survival and morality, and how desperate actions can shape history in profound and irrevocable ways. Lot, still unaware of his grandchildren's true parentage, raised them without suspicion. His daughters, in turn, devoted themselves to their children, but the weight of the secret they carried was reflected in every look exchanged between them. It was as if the cave itself, which had witnessed the beginning of everything, kept the silence of that secret. In time, the descendants of Moab and Ben-Ammi grew to become the founders of the Moabites and the Ammonites. These people, who arose from an act of desperation, would later become enemies and rivals of Israel, the nation descended from Abraham, Lot's uncle. As the years passed, the sons of Moab and Ben-Ammi grew up and began to establish their own tribes. The isolation of the mountains did not prevent these tribes from prospering and becoming powerful nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites. Although born of tragic and morally complex circumstances, they played significant roles in the history of the region. The Moabites, descendants of Moab, settled east of the Dead Sea. They became a people who, throughout biblical history, would have a complex and often hostile relationship with the Israelites. Similarly, the Ammonites, descendants of Ben-Ammi, settled northeast of Israelite territory and also came into conflict with Israel on several occasions. These nations, born of a desperate decision in a cave, proved to be not only an extension of Lot's legacy, but also a constant reminder of the dark events that led to his birth. Lot's bloodline continued, but the implications of its preservation left deep and lasting marks on history. Opinion: Lot's legacy, carried on through Moab and Ben-Ammi, serves as a powerful example of how decisions made in moments of desperation can have far-reaching repercussions beyond what one might imagine. The creation of two nations from such a morally ambiguous action highlights the complexity of the legacy we leave behind and the way our choices, even the most difficult and desperate, shape not only our own destiny, but the destiny of many. This narrative is a reminder that while the past may be dark, it is also inevitably an inseparable part of the future. Over time, the stories of the Moabites and Ammonites became intertwined with that of Israel, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies. And although the circumstances of their birth were known to few, the truth of their origin always hung like a shadow over their relations with the descendants of Abraham. Thus, Lot's name was not forgotten, but the price paid for its continuation was high. His daughters ensured his descendants, but at the cost of an inheritance marked by conflict and tension. The cave in the mountains that had been his refuge became the stage for a complex legacy that would endure for generations.